Colonel Isaac Trabue from Russell County, Kentucky. Trabue was a Union Civil War veteran, a successful lawyer and politician, the founding father of a small town named Trabue, later renamed Punta Gorda, and the man responsible for bringing the railroad to town. In the early 1880s, Trabue started investing in land on the southern shoreline of the Peace River, right across the river from another settlement called Hickory Bluff. One of his many investments was a 30-acre tract with a small 18 by 15-foot cabin that he purchased sight unseen in 1883 from James Lanier, a hunter and trapper, and his wife Sarah. In 1884, Trabue commissioned Mr. Kelly Harvey to survey and plat his land holdings in an effort to create a new town that he is going to name after himself, Trabue. After the plat was recorded the following year, Trabue visited his new venture and discovered to his dismay that much of his waterfront land was underwater during the rainy season. Nevertheless, Isaac hired John Cross, a real estate agent, and his cousin John Trabue to try to sell building lots in his town. Sales were slow, so Trabue had to devise a way to make his town more appealing to potential buyers. Hearing that the Florida Southern Railway was planning on building a rail line to Hickory Bluff, Trabue hastily traveled to Boston to try to convince the board of directors to come to his town instead. It was a hard sell. Trabue offered half of his property to the railroad for the right-of-way and space for a new hotel that the railroad wanted to build, and the directors agreed. Construction of the new Charlotte Harbor Division from Bartow to Trabue started in September 1885, and the first train pulled by a narrow-gauge Baldwin engine arrived in Trabue in July 1886. Here is a map of modern-day Punta Gorda with an overlay showing the tracks and some of the structures that existed in 1897. Notice a blue line showing where the original shoreline was until it was backfilled to extend it further into the Peace River in the 1920s. The Turning Y Depot and Hotel Spur Track, the Hotel Punta Gorda, Isaac Trabue's Ice Factory, and the Long Dock. The railroad dock at the end of the line served the Morgan Steamship Line, which regularly transported passengers and freight to and from New Orleans, Key West, and Havana, Cuba. In order to reach water deep enough for the steamships, the pier had to extend 4,200 feet into the river. The appropriately named Long Dock played host to several fish packing houses, a post office, a general store, and a bank. To promote ridership on the railroad, the Florida Southern built the Grand Resort Hotel as a vacation destination for travelers. Materials and manpower arriving by train built a sprawling, upscale, 150-room waterfront hotel in just 6 months. Completed in time for the winter tourist season in 1887, the Hotel Punta Gorda boasted amenities such as natural gas, electric bells, steam heat, open fireplaces, and for the most affluent guests, a 1,200-foot pier to dock their yachts, and a spur track to park their private railroad cars. Like so many other railroads in the early days, the Florida Southern Railway fell into hard times and went into receivership in 1890. When it emerged, it was reorganized as the Florida Southern Railroad, with Henry Plant, founder of the Plant system of railroads and steamship lines, as one of its directors. Henry got right to work, and one of the first things he did was to have the narrow 3-foot gauge tracks, as shown on the left, widened to the standard 4-foot 8-gauge on the right. Business was good until severe weather destroyed the citrus industry in central and northern Florida in 1896, and no crops meant no shipping revenue from the railroad. The discouraged stock and bondholders, wanting to recoup their investments, relinquished all control of the railroad and allowed it to be fully integrated into Henry Plant's Plant System Railroad. The Long Dock made Punta Gorda a prosperous global seaport for 11 years. That is until Henry Plant had some sort of disagreement with Trabue in 1897. It was said that after the altercation, Plant shouted from his private railroad car, "I'll make a whistle stop of it if you're blankety-blank town," and he had all the tracks serving Trabue's Ice Factory and the Long Dock removed. Mr. Plant wasn't worried about losing revenue, as he owned the Grand Tampa Bay Hotel, his own steamship line, and a huge dock facility further north in Port Tampa. What he did do to protect his other interests in Punta Gorda was to build a shorter railroad dock and a larger passenger and freight depot on King Street right next to the Hotel Punta Gorda. This dock could only handle shallow draft vessels since the water was only 5 feet deep, and the all-important ice for the packing houses was provided by one of Trebu's competitors, the Punta Gorda Ice and Power Company, which was located on the tracks nearby. Henry Plant died in 1899, and his wife Margaret wanted nothing to do with his railroad empire. In 1902, she found a buyer, the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, which became the dominant railroad in Florida after the purchase. Unlike Henry Plant, who had no interest in extending the railroad any further south, the Atlantic Coast Line laid tracks to Fort Myers in 1904, and that city immediately started reaping the benefits of their new rail service. In 1913, the railroad dock on King Street was experiencing so much train traffic that the Punta Gorda Ice and Electric Company was having a difficult time delivering ice to the waiting packing houses and ships. One solution to the problem was to build their own dock just east of the railroad dock and connect it to their factory by means of a narrow gauge track. A small steam locomotive similar to this one was used to haul their carloads of ice to the docks. Because most of the building materials used in the early days was flammable, Punta Gorda was plagued with fires, many caused by sparks from the wood and coal-burning locomotives. The King Street dock was badly damaged by such a fire in 1915, but it was quickly rebuilt. Unfortunately, many of the uninsured fish packing houses never reopened. The 1920s brought a land boom to Florida, and in response to the new demand, the Atlantic Coast Line partnered with Baring Collier and other local businessmen to acquire the dormant charter of the Fort Myers Southern Railroad. By doing so, they were able to extend the ACL to Bonita Springs in 1924, then to Naples and Collier City, which is now Marco Island, in 1927. The railroad business was indeed booming. The area around the King Street dock was bustling with activity, but the number of guests at the Hotel Punta Gorda was dwindling, due in part to the constant noise and smoke from the railroad and the horrendous odors from the fish packing houses. The new owner of the hotel, Baring Collier, came up with a plan to improve business and struck a deal with the city leaders and the Atlantic Coast Line. Collier remodeled and enlarged the hotel and grounds and renamed it the Hotel Charlotte Harbor in 1927. The vacationers started returning, and many more prominent guests stayed at the hotel until it suspiciously burnt down in 1959. The city constructed a new municipal pier at the end of Maud Street, far away from the hotel, and removed the King Street and hotel docks. In 1928, the Atlantic Coast Line tore down the King Street Depot and built a beautiful new Neo-Spanish style depot on the main line a little further out of town. He also laid tracks to serve the new Maud Street dock. The Atlantic Coast Line was able to survive the 1929 stock market crash and Great Depression. However, the rival Seaboard Airline found itself struggling financially and went into receivership in 1930. The Seaboard Airline depot in downtown Naples served passengers for only a couple of years, but freight traffic continued until the Fort Myers and Naples service was discontinued in 1933. The Atlantic Coast Line acquired 7 miles of the Seaboard Airlines right-of-way to Naples and its more conveniently located depot in 1944. That same year, the Atlantic Coast Line removed the seldom-used rails to Marco Island. Times were a-changing. The golden age of railroad passenger travel and freight hauling was declining, a victim of new interstate highway system and a growing trucking and airline industries. Railroad bankruptcies, downsizing, and mergers were the new norm. In 1967, the Atlantic Coast Line merged with its competitor, the Seaboard Airline, to become the Seaboard Coast Line Railroad. The new railroad was able to slash their operating costs by eliminating a vast amount of redundant rail lines and resources. In 1971, after Amtrak was created, passenger service to Naples and Punta Gorda was discontinued. Freight service to Punta Gorda ended a few years later. In 1979, the Seaboard Coast Line abandoned and removed the rails from downtown Naples to North Naples. In 1986, after several successive consolidations, the Seaboard Coast Line became part of the CSX transportation system. In 1987, the Seminole Gulf Railroad, a short line railroad, acquired 2 rights-of-ways from CSX, the Sarasota subdivision and the Fort Myers subdivision. There are still a few vestiges of the early rail era remaining in Punta Gorda. The original 1904 right-of-way from Arcadia to North Naples still exists and is used by the Seminole Gulf Railroad, which provides both freight service and a popular excursion called the Murder Mystery Dinner Train. A very short section of the turning Y that once ran to the hotel still exists, but it ends in a material company yard on King Street. Another very short section of the track that once ran to the Long Dock and later the Maud Street Dock is also intact. The Punta Gorda Ice and Power Company building, built on a turning Y in the late 1890s, still stands today, despite falling into disrepair and being severely damaged by Hurricane Charlie in 2004. The owner wouldn't give it up though, and had the building, which is located on the corner of Tamiami and Virginia Streets, rebuilt and converted into commercial space. Rail service to the Maud Street Dock continued until the 1970s, at which time the pier was mostly unused and dilapidated. In 1977, the City Council voted to repurpose the pier, and 2 years later, Earl Nightingale, a well-known radio commentator, discovered it and thought it would be a great location for a restaurant. With the help and vision of Don Donaldson, a local developer, the two created the famous Fisherman's Village. The tracks going to the pier were removed, and the right-of-way was converted to the beautiful linear park. Two historical markers are all that remind us of a couple of prominent structures that have long since disappeared. One near the corner of Marion and Taylor Streets is dedicated to the Hotel Punta Gorda, and one on Marion just west of Jamaica Way is dedicated to the southernmost railroad terminus, the Long Dock. Finally, the attractive Neo-Spanish style depot built in Punta Gorda by the Atlantic coastline in 1928 still stands proudly. Long shuttered after the loss of passenger and freight service in 1971, the derelict building at 1009 Taylor Street was eventually purchased by local landowner Fred Babcock. His intent was to turn it into a restaurant, however his plans for the depot changed. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1990, and Mr. Babcock later donated it to the Punta Gorda Historical Society in 1997. For the next 7 years, over 30 hardworking volunteers devoted countless hours restoring the building to its original splendor. The depot's 2 waiting rooms and the ticket office now serve as a historic museum, while the freight area is used as commercial space.